A Republican political consultant and polling expert, Collin Corbett, joins us now. He's with Core Strategies, speaking from his office in Palatine. You've been dissecting the November election returns, and you've discovered that Illinois actually did see, if you squint just right, there was a tiny little red wave here.
Yeah, you have to look at the underlying data, which takes a few months to come out. So most people have moved on from November, but some of this data takes 3 months to be available. So we're just now getting access to some of the November election data. And every factor that you'd look for to see what we would call a red wave in terms of turnout, in terms of who showed up, who didn't show up, it should have been a really, really strong Republican year. The people who showed up to vote at the polls, they're all people who typically vote Republican, but this time they didn't.
But you're saying actually Republican voters turned out, but some of them voted Democratic, huh? And women did not, in fact, surge to the polls. There were more men that turned out than 2 years ago?
Yeah, all of us made the assumption that after Dobbs, Republican or women were going to show up in droves to go vote. And then when you see Republicans do poorly at the polls and Democrats do well, you just assume that means, yes, women showed up. Now that we finally have access to the data, we're seeing that female turnout dropped off significantly. It dropped off 16% in Chicago. It dropped off 11% in Cook County. I mean, it was down massively. It wasn't female turnout that ruled the election, which is exactly the opposite of what all of us assumed.
So, and actually, when you look at it statewide, the male percentage of the electorate was actually 2% larger as a share than a couple years ago.
Yeah, so male turnout was down as well. Overall turnout was down 5%. So voters were just disinterested in this election in general. But yes, based on the fact that males dropped much less than females did, the vote share is what we call it, how much of a percentage of the vote each demographic controls. That vote share dropped by a significant amount. Females made up a 5% less of the vote share when you look at certain areas. It was 2% statewide, but in some areas like Chicago and Cook County, it was even more than that. Males were a much stronger force in this last election.
So you're a student of Chicago politics as well as Illinois politics. So what do you think this portends for the mayor's race? Because certainly when you walk around town, there are some parts of town where there's some excitement, but I would say most of Chicago is not really lit up about this mayor's race.
No, and it's a month away, so you'd be expecting to see a lot more right now. The other thing we saw in the data from November, and if we're going to try to predict future behavior, our best thing to look at is past behavior. So we look at November, and what we saw was historically low turnout among black voters in black wards all throughout the city of Chicago. And we saw very low turnout amongst Hispanics. So if that continues, which, as you said, we're seeing that trend continue here 3 months after Election Day, if that continues all the way through February and April, then that portends some problems for Chuy Garcia, for Lori Lightfoot. I mean, they're really depending on those demographics, which are their base. Chuy always dominates Hispanic vote. Lori Lightfoot does very well with the black vote. So you'd expect that if those two demographics turn out much less in February and April, that's a big warning sign for both of those candidates.
So what would you do if you were those two candidates?
Well, I think the strategy has changed. I mean, you saw that Chuy Garcia suddenly decided to take this race seriously just this week. I think he's been coasting, assuming he'd make it to the runoff, but the data says that he might not even make it to the runoff at this point. Lori Lightfoot's been running, she's been running scared for months, which she should have. That's the right strategy to take. But Vallas is surging as the non-Chuy Garcia, Lori Lightfoot candidate. Paul Vallas has been surging, and at this point, both Lightfoot and Garcia are in danger of not making the runoff. Only two candidates make it. So if Vallas makes it, then that means only either Chuy or Lightfoot will make it. So they have two choices. They can either attack each other to try to get in a runoff with Vallas, whichever of them makes the runoff will likely win that runoff, or they try to knock out Vallas now so the two of them can go duke it out in the runoff. It'll be interesting to see which of those paths they take, but they don't have a lot of time. They're going to have to go hard at one of those directions and do it immediately.
So you think Vallas is vulnerable? in a runoff.
He is. I mean, certainly a lot of his support is not necessarily for Vallis. It's against Lightfoot, and it's just looking for an alternative. A lot of those voters who are going towards Vallis, specifically white voters, they're not monolithic. You have white voters in the north side of Chicago who are pretty progressive. They're not going to like a lot of Vallis's policies. You have other voters who just don't want Lightfoot, and they don't like Garcia. But once they hear more about Vallis or any of the other candidates, they might not be as likely to vote for them. So Vallis has surged because people don't know much about him. I think that if one of the other candidates go hard against him, it'll certainly lower his support levels. Will it lower it enough to keep him out of the runoff? At this point, I don't know. They might have waited too long.
All right. Collin Corbett of Core Strategies joining us from Palatine. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.